Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Today's program is an interview I recorded by phone a few days ago. The content of that interview is outstanding, but the technical quality of the phone call was lacking. It's not unlistenable, but there is a fair amount of digital interference that you may find to be a bit distracting. So as you listen, ignore the noise and pay attention to what my guest is saying. I think you'll find the subject of today's program to be quite valuable. Just know that the digital noise you hear is not your radio, or if you're listening to the online stream or the podcast, it's not your connection or your device. It's in the original recording. So with that out of the way, I'll hit the play button and we'll get on with today's Mike Bates Show. Here we go. A lot of what we talk about here on the Mike Bates Show are important facts the news media doesn't include in their stories. But we also make it a point to discuss important topics most of the news media doesn't report at all. And it is that latter category we will engage in today. Because there's a situation literally on the other side of the world that could have major implications for Americans, yet very few people are aware of it. Dr. Mike Hunzecker is a professor at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, where he is also the Associate Director of the Center for Security Policy Studies. Dr. Hunzecker recently testified to the Congressional U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission about Taiwan. And it is for that reason I invited him to appear on today's program. Dr. Hunzecker, welcome to the Mike Bates Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Dr. Hunzecker, most people are aware that what we now call Taiwan used to be part of mainland China until Kai-shek and the nationalists fled there when the communists took over China in 1949. And most people know that the People's Republic of China, the communists, consider it to still be a Chinese province that they're entitled to govern and that they regularly threaten to retake by force if necessary. Before we get into the details of the current state of affairs, can you give us a quick synopsis of Taiwan History 101 for those who aren't familiar with it?
This is a great question, and I think it is important to point out that actually there's quite a bit of historical debate as to the degree to which China actually exercised political control over Taiwan, especially in that period that you're talking about. So going back centuries, Taiwan obviously located 90 to 100 miles off of China's coast, but the fact of the matter is that it existed as an autonomous, independent, sovereign entity for most of world history. And although there were many people from China over the centuries that made their way across the Taiwan Strait onto the island, there were also Aborigines who have been there for thousands of years. And really, it wasn't until about the 19th century that the political authorities on China attempted to exercise any sort of real political control over Taiwan. And that brings us to the war that China had with Japan at the end of the 19th century, which China lost. And as a concession to Japan, China gave over quote unquote control of an island, which is debatable whether or not it really exercised that control, but gave it over to Japan, at which point Japan in 1895 takes over control over Taiwan, occupies the island, and that lasts all the way until the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, of course, Japan losing to the United States and its ally China at the time, the United States basically gives permission to hand Taiwan back over to China, but it's, again, not clear that the United States had that authority or that China really was the rightful heir to that political authority. Either way, Chiang Kai-shek, the loser of the Chinese Civil War, then, of course, evacuates his military forces over to Taiwan, and by dint of the fact that he had most of the guns and most of the military power, was able to successfully, control the island and its population. So that brings us all the way up to the present day. But it's very important to remember that this issue of who exercises legitimate political control over Taiwan is a deeply and historically contested issue. Obviously, the Chinese government has its very clearly stated position on the matter. The United States has an explicit policy on the matter, which leaves open the possibility for the two sides to negotiate some sort of a settlement. And then the government of Taiwan has a very difficult needle to thread. But very important to remember that I don't think it's an open and shut case that China controlled Taiwan and then Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan, and that's where that issue started.
Well, the United States used to recognize Taiwan's sovereignty until 1979, when President Carter formally ended diplomatic relations with Taiwan and normalized relations with mainland China. Can you remind us why he did that?
So what his move really was following on a series of attempts that started under the Nixon administration when Nixon made his famous trip, sends Kissinger over to China. But really, this comes back to an attempt by the United States to geostrategically exploit this growing schism between China and the Soviet Union as part of a larger Cold War strategy. And the idea was, by warming relations with China, could drive a wedge between those two communist actors that would create all sorts of challenges with the Soviet Union.
And until 1971, Taiwan represented China in the United Nations, right? It was only in 1971 when the UN replaced Taiwan with mainland China. And it's my understanding Nixon actually wanted them both to have representation, but the UN wouldn't go along with that, mostly because China wouldn't go along with that. Is that correct?
Well, exactly. And it's also important, again, not to split definitional hairs, but we did not recognize Taiwan as Taiwan. We recognized Taiwan as the Republic of China, which is to say that we saw this as being a zero-sum game. There was a China, and we were going to recognize Taiwan as being the Republic of China, the rightful representative of the entire Chinese population. And then we shifted that recognition from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China, which leaves open this larger question of Taiwan's status as a sovereign political entity in the international system.
Well, the United States says it supports a one China policy, that it doesn't recognize Taiwan today as an independent sovereign state. But is that really just rhetoric to appease communist China? I mean, we don't support Beijing ruling Taipei, and we know Taipei ain't going to rule Beijing. So what do we mean by a one China policy?
So I think it's very important to remember the United States has never recognized Taiwan as being a part of the People's Republic of China. It simply acknowledges that Beijing's position is that Taiwan is indeed part of the People's Republic of China. But the official policy is that Taiwan's status is undetermined, and we are intentionally ambiguous about that because we want to leave the final resolution of this deeply political and historical and cultural question up to the two parties that are concerned. I think the reason that we persist in this policy has a lot to do with very simple geopolitical, economic, and military realities. Were the United States to just clearly come out and say that we recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation, that might provoke the sort of conflict that the United States would prefer, all things equal, not to engage in.
So is that the large benefit of the ambiguity in our policy, is that we don't poke the bear, or in this case, the dragon?
I think that has been the traditional justification from this posture of what's become known as strategic ambiguity, whereby successive presidential administrations have made clear that we will not be clear about the conditions under which we might deploy military force to intervene in a crisis. And the idea was to practice what we now call dual deterrence. We clearly wanted to deter Beijing from undertaking forceful annexation unilaterally. And we also wanted to deter Taipei from unilaterally taking steps to declare their independence, which of course we were concerned might trigger a military conflict.
And it is that potential military conflict that is really the purpose of this conversation you and I are having, because if it occurs, the United States would obviously have some involvement. I don't know what that will be. I'm not sure the American government knows what that would be. But we had a defense treaty with Taiwan since the 1950s, but that was terminated after the U.S. established formal diplomatic ties with Beijing in 1979. And some people believe that that was replaced with the Taiwan Relations Act, but it's my understanding that the Taiwan Relations Act doesn't obligate the United States to actually defend Taiwan. It only says that we will sell them weapons and that we will maintain sufficient U.S. military forces in the Pacific to be capable of defending Taiwan, but it actually obligates us to nothing. Is that an accurate assessment of the Taiwan Relations Act?
Yes, I believe that is a succinct and accurate way of summarizing what it is that the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act legally requires the United States to do. And it is very important, as you have aptly done, to distinguish that from a mutual defense treaty, which does create a legal obligation to intervene on an ally's behalf. And that requirement does not exist and has not since we left that treaty at the beginning of 1980.
Okay, so with that basic historical information out of the way, I'd like to take a quick break, and then when we get back, I want to bring the conversation into today and what is happening on that side of the Pacific. We will do that when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. With me on the phone is Dr. Mike Hunzecker. He's a professor at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, where he is also the associate director of the Center for Security Policy Studies, and he recently testified before a congressional commission regarding Taiwan. So that's the conversation we are having with him today. The last segment, Mike, we talked about the historic Taiwan and what our obligations may or may not be to Taiwan. Bringing it to the present day, the Chinese have stepped up their rhetoric recently about reclaiming Taiwan and have increased military activity in and over the Taiwan Strait. Why have they done that?
I think the answer is quite clear. Number one, the Chinese government is sending a unambiguous message to back up and to reinforce their unambiguous rhetoric that they consider Taiwan an inalienable part of China, that they do not intend to, quote unquote, kick the proverbial can down the road forever, that this is an issue that has languished for far too long, and that they intend to assert political control over the island. It goes without saying they would prefer to do so and to achieve that goal without having to resort to force. But I think by exercising these military capabilities, by sending military planes into Taiwanese airspace and air defense identification zones and into Taiwanese maritime waters, that what they're showing is, number one, that they would be willing to consider using military force. At the same time, they are exercising their own capabilities to improve their own military options were they to choose to go that route.
And what has been Taiwan's response to that?
I think Taiwan has responded in positive ways, and by positive, I mean, I think Chinese aggression, especially of the military sort, but also what we have seen politically occurring in Hong Kong, that this has really opened the Taiwanese people's eyes to the nature and the depth of the threat.
Well, what has America's response been to that?
So, especially under the Trump administration, there have been a few different sort of strands. Number one, politically, again, the Trump administration in particular, although I think we're seeing a lot of continuity under the Biden administration, but was very clear about politically signaling its intention and resolve to support Taiwan, in particular to live up to these legal obligations created by the Taiwan Relations Act. And so we have seen in successive occasions, the Trump administration sending high-level officials over to visit Taiwan, again, in part to signal that we're willing to do these sorts of things. We've also seen a real increase in the both amount and quality of arms that are being sold to Taiwan. And this actually traces back even before the Trump administration. The Obama administration has sold something like $14 billion worth of weapons to the island between 2008 2016. The Trump administration, I think something around the range of $18 billion were sold over a period of 4 years. I would anticipate a similar trajectory moving forward. We've also seen, especially under the Trump administration, and that we've seen under the Biden administration, an increased willingness to send our own military forces into the area, in particular by sailing our military ships through the Taiwan Strait, which is always a provocative move, especially from Beijing's perspective, but to signal that we do not recognize China's claims, that we are not willing to allow China to sort of try to use military intimidation, and we have the ability and the wherewithal to intervene if we so chose.
Well, with Taiwan being 100 miles roughly off the coast of mainland China, clearly there's plenty of sea that is in international waters, so we have every right to send U.S. Navy ships through the strait, right?
there's no question under maritime law and maritime tradition that those are open oceans and open waters for us to navigate.
So what do the Chinese hope to accomplish by sending ships and planes across the Taiwan Strait? Is it just to annoy, or is it to gather intelligence such as detection and response timing that would be useful should they decide to launch an actual invasion?
By doing things like sending military aircraft into air defense identification zones, sailing ships into Taiwanese or very close to Taiwanese waters, what they're attempting to do is first send a signal that they're willing to do these things. They're willing to kind of rock the proverbial boat, showing Taiwan and the United States that they are indeed serious. Second, I do believe that there are intelligence, operational, and tactical advantages to doing these things. You're probing Taiwan's defenses, you're probing Taiwan's responses, its response times. Third, you're exercising your own military capabilities. China's military, which we call the People's Liberation Army, it is large. China has been investing a ton of money, time, and energy into modernizing that force, but we have to remember it has not fought a large-scale conflict in decades. So it certainly looks great on paper, but there are a lot of question marks as to its ability to actually operate under combat conditions. And so doing these types of operations gives its pilots and its sailors and its soldiers, to the degree that land operations are a part of these, the opportunity to work together to exercise their skills. The last thing I think that China is attempting to accomplish, whether it knew it was doing this in the beginning or not, I'm not sure, but it definitely seems to be an unintended benefit that China is now taking advantage of, which is by sending jets into Taiwan's air defense identification zones and sailing ships near Taiwanese waters. It's causing Taiwan to respond by scrambling its own jets and ships. And this is actually placing a lot of wear and tear on Taiwan's military capabilities. And this is starting to become a point of concern that by surging more and more aircraft and more Chinese ships into these spaces, you're provoking more and more responses and intercept missions by the Taiwanese. And you might be gaining some long-term advantages by just wearing down Taiwanese military readiness. And it's very important to remember China has been investing heavily in its military capabilities. It's been buying lots of new cutting-edge weapons, but it also has massive quantitative advantages over Taiwan. So where Taiwan has a relatively small number of jets and ships and a relatively small number of pilots and sailors, China has a lot more it can throw at the problem. And so it can conduct these exercises, these intercepts, these movements into Taiwanese airspace and waters when it wants to. Taiwan is then in the position of having to react whenever it must. It doesn't necessarily have the time and the energy to let the pilots rest to make sure that the aircraft are being maintained properly. And over time, we are starting to see, it sounds like, China actually, it used to, when it did these missions, it would send in only its best aircraft. Now it's sending in some of its older platforms. And that's interesting because it suggests that it's realizing it's got these quantitative benefits or advantages. And it's able to throw more things at Taiwan, forcing Taiwan to react more and more often. And it's starting to wear down the force. And that's a reason for concern.
All right. Dr. Hunzecker, I'd love to talk to you about what an actual invasion would look like. So I will ask you that question when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. I have with me on the telephone Dr. Mike Hunzecker. He's a professor at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and he's also the associate director of the Center for Security Policy Studies. We are talking about China and Taiwan, which, yes, they may be exactly halfway around the world, but they matter in geopolitical senses to the United States and also in economic senses. We do a lot of trade with, obviously, China, but we do a lot of trade with Taiwan as well. This is not a military conflict we would welcome, and I'm not sure, frankly, anybody would benefit from it. But it is perhaps, hopefully not, but perhaps looming on the horizon. And because very few people are talking about it, that's why we are. So, Dr. Hunzecker, what do you think an invasion would look like if the Chinese did decide, we mean it now? What do you think they would do?
My opinion on this, and I think it is important to state that not everybody shares this opinion. My opinion on this is that if China decided that it was going to use military force to annex Taiwan, to bring it under China's control, that it would require the Chinese military to undertake what would arguably be the largest amphibious, and that would also include a large air element, but the largest amphibious assault in history. Just to kind of show the scope and scale of the problem, number one, we have to remember Taiwan, it's small compared to the United States and many other countries, but it's still an island. Takes about 6 hours to drive from north to south. It's got jungles, it's got rice paddies, it's got mega cities. It has mountainous terrain. It has 23 million people. This is not a small piece of terrain or a small group of people that China would have to subdue. Second, in order to accomplish this goal of exercising political control over the island, China ostensibly would have to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops, to the degree that the Taiwanese people would not be willing to just kind of gladly submit to Chinese rule. And I am pretty confident in saying they would not be, or a sizable percentage of the population would resist. This is going to take hundreds of thousands of troops that the Chinese are going to have to somehow get from China to Taiwan in order to do this, which brings up the third point. 90 miles of water may not seem like much, but I was a Marine officer and an amphibious assault officer, so this was sort of my business when I was an active duty officer. 90 miles it's a lot of water. And Taiwan doesn't actually have many suitable landing beaches that would be sufficiently large enough to handle the types of ships and troops and equipment to offload. So it would just be a massive undertaking. And Taiwan has a very effective military that would be able to impose a lot of costs, force the Chinese to lose a lot of ships, lose a lot of troops. It's got some pretty decent air defense capabilities that would shoot down a lot of Chinese planes. So for China to do this, it would have to be all in. It would have to be, quote unquote, willing to bear any price and bear any burden. And to do so would require the Chinese leadership to recognize that this would kind of be an all or nothing proposition. I personally can't see that if China were to go this route of an all-out invasion and it were to fail, that the regime in Beijing would be able to survive.
Well, hopefully the Chinese government realizes that and will think long and hard before deciding to do something, and perhaps best deciding against it. Mainland China clearly has a large quantitative advantage over Taiwan. Do they also have a qualitative advantage over Taiwan militarily?
Yes. So for many years, the Chinese military was really big. The Taiwanese military has always been very small just by dint of the Taiwanese population. But the Taiwanese, even in addition to being able to rely on a U.S. mutual defense treaty up until 1979, or technically January 1st of 1980, Taiwan was also able to purchase a lot of usually secondhand American equipment. And therefore, in essence, Taiwan could offset Chinese quantitative advantages with just more effective, qualitatively capable American military equipment. The problem is, especially in light of China's continued investment in military modernization, that the military balance in the region has just shifted decisively. And now China enjoys both a quantitative and arguably a qualitative advantage, and these gaps are just growing. And, these are just the sorts of trend lines that are inexorable and over time will only grow worse.
You mentioned that Taiwan has a lot of former U.S. military equipment. Do we only give them hand-me-downs, or do we sell them our latest and greatest?
In recent years, we've been selling them new military equipment and or helping them upgrade military equipment that they had purchased from us previously and getting it up to standard so it is kind of on the cutting edge of what we can offer. So we nowadays are selling them new equipment, but the challenge that Taiwan faces at this point is it just cannot afford enough of these high-tech, high-quality, high-expense weapons to offset the fact that China now has fairly large numbers of pretty darn good equipment themselves.
So how long do you think Taiwan would last without direct military engagement by the United States assisting them?
I would not want to venture a guess. There are so many ways that a potential invasion could unfold, and so much of this would ultimately boil down to political resolve. In other words, the will of the people to resist in light of whatever it is that China were to decide to throw at them. And the specter of an all-out invasion of hundreds of thousands of PLA troops coming across the Taiwan Strait, which will probably occur in conjunction with massive cyber strikes, thousands of missiles raining down on Taiwan, a major naval blockade of the island. It would be impossible to say what that might do to the Taiwanese people and their willingness to fight and withstand, especially if there's still ambiguity as to whether or not the United States would intervene. So I don't think it's possible for anyone to answer it. Certainly, I wouldn't want to venture a guess. That said, I do believe that there are steps that the Taiwanese military and the Taiwanese people can and should undertake, which, although I couldn't put a precise date on it, I think would almost indisputably allow them to hold out much longer than they could given the capabilities they have on hand right now. And this is why I'm included in a fairly large number of defense analysts who have been pushing Taiwan to embrace what we call an asymmetric defense posture, which many of us believe would, again, give them the ability to kind of withstand an invasion, hold out, and give the United States more time for its allies and partners to intervene if they so chose.
Now, when I hear somebody say asymmetric warfare, I'm thinking terrorism versus conventional weaponry. What do you mean by that?
In general terms, asymmetry simply means instead of fighting your adversary toe-to-toe, strength on strength, you are going to pit your relative advantages against their relative disadvantages. So right now, Taiwan's defense posture is largely symmetric. An asymmetric posture is one where instead of saying we're going to fight them in the air, we're going to fight them at sea, we're going to fight them on the beaches, toe-to-toe, soldier for soldier, tank for tank, it instead says we are going to get rid of or divest of our inventory, which is built around small numbers of very expensive high-end platforms, and we are instead going to buy military equipment. We're going to buy large numbers of cheap and small things, redundant weapon systems that you can throw at an invading force, because Taiwan does have the big advantage. They hold the ground. They simply have to be able to deny a Chinese invader the ability to get across the Taiwan Strait and come ashore and fight their way into the city at a cost that the Chinese are willing to pay. So buying lots of things like air defense missiles, coastal defense missiles, naval mines, reorganizing their ground forces away from large battalions that are going to fight very static battles for the beaches, and instead making them into small mobile teams that will sort of do hit and run attacks on any PLA troops that do manage to make their way ashore. By doing these sorts of things, I think it would put the Chinese military in a real dilemma. It would force the Chinese to recognize there would be no quick victory. And all things equal, if the Chinese are going to be willing to undertake the risk and cost of an invasion, they would prefer a quick one that doesn't even give the United States or its allies the opportunity to intervene. And by doing these sorts of things, it would also create a massive targeting problem. So instead of having to go after a few dozen fighter aircraft and a few dozen surface ships, now you have to go and ferret out hundreds, if not thousands, of coastal defense missile systems, many of which nowadays you can hide in things like cargo trucks. You can hide them in buildings. You can move them around. They're highly mobile. And China would have to hunt these things down before these missiles are able to sink large numbers of their invasion force. So this would make it very difficult for the Chinese. I think it would enhance deterrence by raising the cost of undertaking military action. It would also give the United States and its partners in the region lots of options and opportunities to intervene. And I think it would suggest to the Chinese and to the American people that the Taiwanese people are genuinely serious about doing everything they can in their power to make themselves more defensible.
Do the Taiwanese people, the civilians, I mean, are they well armed? Do they have, to use a term in the U.S. Constitution, do they have a right to keep and bear arms? And do they? Do the civilians have weapons themselves?
No, they do not. One might imagine, given Taiwan's geostrategic position, that it would be sort of like a Switzerland with an M16 in every home. But that is very much not the case. It is very difficult to obtain firearms in Taiwan. And there are questions as to whether or not the military even has enough small arms to equip all of its reservists and conscripts that it could call to active duty in a crisis. And so it goes without saying then that the people themselves are not armed or trained, and that's probably equally important, to resist as Taiwan is currently kind of prepared.
So if the People's Republic of China got past Taiwan's defenses, the occupation would not be an issue, apparently.
I'm not saying it would not be an issue. There are always all sorts of creative options. And one thing I certainly learned the hard way in Iraq in 2003 and 2004 is that a creative and determined people have options for resisting. And the Taiwanese, I think, safe to say, many of them would be creative and very determined.
Obviously, the United States would denounce any invasion diplomatically, and we'd probably impose some economic sanctions too. But do you think the U.S. would get involved militarily? We're not obligated to. Do you think we would?
I think it would be a fool's errand to guess that in advance. Much of it would depend on the administration in power at the time, on sort of public perception and high-level policymaker perception of the Chinese threat, of the military options, and again, how exactly this invasion unfolds. To the degree the Chinese could undertake this more quickly, it would create some challenges in the United States. Even if we wanted to intervene, there could be a powerful argument to say that there's nothing we can do. This is a so-called fait accompli. And come back to a point I had mentioned briefly earlier when you asked what would an invasion look like. There are some people who disagree with my assumption that if China wanted to exercise political control and use military force to do so, I believe it would take an all-out invasion. But some people think, well, China could just grab a couple of outlying islands, maybe form a military quarantine, Cuban Missile Crisis style around Taiwan. And this might be sufficient in conjunction with some cyber attacks or some missile strikes to break the will of the Taiwanese people and to convince the United States not to intervene. I tend to discount those. I think that those sorts of moves, instead of causing the Taiwanese people to fold, would actually stiffen their resolve. And it would actually buy more time for the United States to make a decision. So in my mind, those sorts of scenarios are actually half measures that might actually work to our advantage. But in my estimation, in a full-out invasion, it would be very hard for China to hide those preparations, which means I think the United States would get early warning. We would have time to have those debates and those discussions. But again, how the United States would decide to act, I think, is so dependent on the people actually making the decisions at the time that I just wouldn't want to venture a guess.
We are speaking with Dr. Mike Hunzecker, a professor at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, where he's also the associate director of the Center for Security Policy Studies. We're going to take our final break, and when we get back, we're going to discuss the best scenario, and that is no war at all. I will ask him about that when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. We are speaking with Dr. Mike Hunzecker, a professor at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, where he is also the associate director of the Center for Security Policy Studies. He recently testified to the Congressional U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission about Taiwan, and that is why I asked him to appear on today's program. Dr. Hunzecker, I appreciate you coming on board today. So we've talked about in the previous 3 segments the potential for war between China and Taiwan. Let's spend this segment talking about avoiding that war in the first place. What steps can the United States, and I suppose Taiwan too, since they're the ones directly involved, what steps can Taiwan, the United States, and our allies take to prevent this conflict from even happening? Wouldn't that be the best solution?
This is a terrific question, and I wish that every conversation either began or ended with this point, because at the end of the day, a conflict scenario, whether we're talking all-out invasion or one of these island grabs or cyber strikes, these are all horrifying possibilities, and we would, on all sides, be best off finding a non-military political resolution to these challenges and questions. So I would suggest that there are 3 things the United States can do. First, in the near term, I think the United States needs to stop sending mixed signals, in particular to Taipei, with its arms sales and some of this rhetoric we hear coming out of Congress that's saying, we're going to do all of these things for Taiwan to defend and protect Taiwan without some clear expectation of what we want Taiwan to do for its own defense. At the end of the day, I believe the Taiwanese people are willing and will prove able to defend themselves. Deterrence will depend on it. But the United States cannot be in the business of caring more about Taiwan's defensibility than Taiwan is. And there is a risk that we sort of create a so-called moral hazard, where if we make it super clear that we're willing to do anything we need to defend Taiwan, to sell it anything that it wants, that we don't actually improve Taiwan's defensibility, and we sort of lull them into a false sense of complacency. So that's the first. The second is that I think the United States should do a top-down, high-level review of its policy towards Taiwan. I know there's a lot of debate, and I think that this debate is very healthy, but I think it's time for the United States to seriously reassess strategic ambiguity. I have written certainly about the need for this reassessment, for this debate. That's an important debate. If nothing else, that sends a powerful signal to Beijing and Taipei. I also think that there is reason to believe strategic ambiguity has outlived its usefulness. I understand that it was created and it was quite useful for many decades, but it was created at a time when there was a genuine concern that Taiwan might try to unilaterally declare independence or provoke a conflict. I think that is a wildly overstated threat. Taiwan is not naive. They know that were they to make a move that China declares to violate one of China's red lines, if they were to declare independence unilaterally, that Taiwan would be the ones who suffered. They would suffer the most, and the United States likely would not intervene. So I think we're almost insulting the Taiwanese people by saying that we have some need to deter them. I also think the even bigger risk with strategic ambiguity is we could find ourselves in the worst world of all, which is a world in which China miscalculates and assumes that it has found some creative way to take over Taiwan that won't trigger a U.S. intervention, and yet we decide to intervene. So If ambiguity increases the risk of Chinese miscalculation and we would have fought anyway, that violates a fundamental principle of deterrence, which, to paraphrase from Dr. Strangelove, what's the point of a doomsday machine if you don't tell the world you have it? The third step, I think, which is very important, is that the United States should not attempt to do this alone. We need to work with our allies and partners in the region. Just like we cannot care about Taiwan's defense more than Taiwan, we also can't care about Taiwan's defense more than Japan, Korea, and other players in the region who have more at stake than we do.
Would rotating U.S. Navy ships, and perhaps even including the rotation ships from the Australian, Japanese, South Korean, and British navies as well, would rotating those ships, not just through the Taiwan Strait, but actual port calls in Taiwan, would that help deter Chinese aggression, or would it just anger the Chinese Communist Party, which would see it as the West meddling in what they consider to be an internal matter?
First off, anything we do which meaningfully makes Taiwan more defensible, China will be outraged by. And so we must accept there's, I think, a tendency to overstate this fear that we're going to inadvertently provoke China into attacking. We need to be clear. China is unambiguous. It plans on annexing the island. It would prefer to do so peacefully, but it's willing to do so militarily, and it's not going to kick this can down the road forever. So you can't provoke somebody who's planning on attacking you anyway. So to some degree, we just have to dismiss that rhetoric and really just focus on the meaningful steps China might be taking to react to some of these moves. Second, I do agree anything that we can do on a military level to show the flag around the region is better than not showing the flag around the region. That said, I am wary of cheap talk, of relatively low-hanging fruit, these kind of symbols where we sail a ship into port and it looks great. And certainly, that gives our sailors and our officers a little bit more exposure to the region, a little bit more training, but it really doesn't meaningfully enhance our ability to do those things. Our ships know how to pull into ports and know how to set sailors ashore, but it doesn't actually meaningfully enhance our ability to operate militarily with allies and partners in the region or even the Taiwanese military. So it's a good step, but China also knows just as easily as we can sail a ship in, we can also sail a ship out. And so China may just miscalculate. Yeah, they're sailing lots of ships through the region, but in the conflict, they'll just sail those ships away instead of fighting. It's better than nothing for sure, but we also need to make sure that we are not doing things which will be provocative, which also don't meaningfully enhance our own ability to fight with our partners and allies. I think it would be better to engage in more military-to-military exercises. And this would, again, this is why a top-down review I think is important. That would be very provocative to Beijing. We would have to calibrate the risks and the benefits accordingly. But to the degree that we can work with Japan, Korea, other allies and actors, Australia in the region, and with the Taiwanese military, it's much better to have practiced these things in advance than to have to make this up ad hoc in the middle of a crisis. I also believe that we probably need to have more on-the-ground training teams in Taiwan. I think there are creative ways we can legally justify these sorts of moves. We've had special operations units. We now have uniformed military Marines in Taiwan guarding our de facto embassy. So having training teams over there does a couple of things. Number one, when we have training teams on the ground, we can meaningfully work with Taiwanese ground forces, air forces, naval forces. We can get them up to speed much faster. Second, when we have forces on the ground, those sorts of things are very difficult to pull out in a crisis. And that would put China in a more difficult position because were it to decide even on things like missile strikes or a blockade of the island, that means there would be American service personnel on the island in a training peaceful capacity, simply living up to our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act, but they would be in harm's way. And China would have to include in their calculations the fact that American servicemen and women may be injured or killed in an attack were they to make that sort of a move. And so these sorts of things, I think, both enhance our actual ability to fight, their ability to fight, and push the risk, the burden on China's side to decide, are they really willing to cross those lines in order to accomplish their objectives?
Well, I certainly hope it doesn't happen for the sake of Taiwan, for the sake of China, and frankly, for the sake of the United States. We don't need it either. I'm certainly no pacifist. I understand the need for a strong military, and I understand the need for there being armed kinetic conflict. I just understand that that really is the last resort and not the first one. And that if we are going to do it, kick ass, get out.
As a combat veteran whose wife is an active duty Army officer and brother's an active duty Army officer, I couldn't agree more, especially in this scenario. It would be so ugly.
I greatly appreciate you coming on the program today, Dr. Hunzecker, and giving us your insight and expertise. This is an issue that really is getting practically no coverage in the media whatsoever. I read about your congressional testimony in Defense News, which is how I found out about your work and you, and that's why I invited you on the program. Very few people read defense news, however. I bet the average American has no clue what's going on over there.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I agree with you. This is an urgent issue. I am glad that it is slowly making its way from the niche and from the margins into the mainstream, but I applaud you and others who are doing what you can to alert the American people, because this is an issue that every American has a stake in, every American should have an opinion on. And I think that Americans should make clear what their expectations and their preferences are, because if a conflict were to occur, it would involve all of us, and we need to be aware of those challenges.
Dr. Hunzecker, professor at George Mason University Schar School of Policy and Government, and also the associate director of the Center for Security Policy Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today on The Mike Bates Show.